October 14th, 1943. Black Thursday. A German fighter pilot watches from his cockpit as another American B-17 spirals toward the Earth in flames, the 60th heavy bomber of the day. He banks his Messerschmitt Bf-109 through the contrails and prepares for another pass. The sky over Schweinfurt is a graveyard. American bombers, stripped of their fighter escorts hundreds of miles back, burn and fall like dying stars. The German pilot knows the truth. His Luftwaffe has won this day. The Americans will not return. They cannot. Their fighters lack the range. Their bombers cannot survive alone. He is right. For 4 months, the skies over Germany belong to the Reich. But in a factory across the Atlantic, engineers are about to unleash something the Luftwaffe has never faced before. Something that will turn the German pilots' home airspace into a killing field from which there is no escape. Something that will force Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself to declare, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." This is not about the finest fighter in the war. Historians still debate that. This is about the fighter that created a strategic nightmare the Luftwaffe could never solve. This is about the North American P-51 Mustang and why it terrified German pilots in a way that even the legendary Spitfire or the brutal Soviet Yak-3 never could. The German Luftwaffe feared many aircraft during World War II. The British Supermarine Spitfire was a ballet dancer in the sky, impossibly agile, deadly in a turning fight, and flown by pilots who had learned their craft defending their homeland during the desperate summer of 1940. German pilots learned quickly: engage a Spitfire in a dogfight at low altitude, and you would likely end up as scattered wreckage across the English countryside. The Spitfire could turn tighter than almost anything the Luftwaffe fielded. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine sang a high-pitched scream as it carved through the air at 360 miles per hour. Armed with 8 303 caliber machine guns, later upgraded to 20mm cannons, the Spitfire carved through bomber formations and dueled German fighters with lethal grace. But the Spitfire had an Achilles heel: range. With an operational radius of roughly 400 miles, the Spitfire was a defender, not an aggressor. It could savage Luftwaffe bombers over Britain and chase German fighters back across the Channel, but it could not follow them home. Once the Messerschmitts crossed back into occupied Europe, they entered a sanctuary the Spitfire could never reach. German pilots respected the Spitfire. They feared it in its element, but they knew its limitation. Pull back beyond the Channel, deeper into Fortress Europe, and the Spitfire could not follow. The Hurricane, the workhorse of the RAF, told the same story. Rugged, stable, and deadly against bombers, the Hurricane accounted for more enemy aircraft destroyed during the Battle of Britain than any other fighter. But like its more famous cousin, the Hurricane was chained to home defense. Its range was better than the Spitfire's, 1,135 miles compared to the Spitfire's 460, but still insufficient for deep penetration into German airspace. For the Luftwaffe defending the Reich, this created a simple tactical reality: survive the gauntlet over the coast, and you reach safety. The British fighters, no matter how deadly, had a leash. On the Eastern Front, the calculus was different, but the limitation was similar. Soviet fighters like the Yakovlev Yak-3 were feared, genuinely feared, by Luftwaffe pilots. The Yak-3 was a lightweight assassin, one of the smallest and lightest fighters of the entire war. Powered by a Klimov VK-105 engine, it achieved a remarkable power-to-weight ratio that made it devastatingly agile below 16,000 feet. In July 1944, the Luftwaffe issued a directive that stunned its own pilots: avoid combat below 5,000 meters with Yakovlev fighters lacking an oil cooler intake beneath the nose. This was an admission of inferiority. The Luftwaffe, masters of aerial combat, were being told to run from a Soviet fighter. At low altitude, the Yak-3 could outturn and outclimb both the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190. Soviet pilots called it the Dancer. German pilots called it Death. When Free French pilots of the Normandy Niemen Regiment flew Yak-3s on the Eastern Front, they scored 99 victories in the type, cementing its reputation as one of the war's elite dogfighters. But the Yak-3 was not designed for strategic reach. It was a tactical knife, meant to dominate the airspace directly over battlefields so that Soviet ground attack aircraft could operate unmolested. Its range was limited. Its role was localized. It cleared the skies over Red Army advances, then returned to forward airstrips for fuel and ammunition. The Lavochkin LA-7 and the American-supplied Bell P-39 Airacobra offered more range, handling longer escort duties over the Eastern Front. But these aircraft operated in a theater defined by different realities: close air support, ground attack, and defensive interception along a massive land front. The Eastern Front was brutal, attritional, and vast. Soviet fighters were designed for it. They dominated their environment, but they were not strategic instruments designed to project power deep into the enemy's industrial heartland. German pilots respected Soviet fighters. They adjusted tactics to avoid them at low altitude, but there was no panic, because Soviet fighters stayed over Soviet territory. They did not hunt you at your home base. They did not escort bombers 1,000 miles into Germany to obliterate your aircraft factories. And then came the Mustang. The P-51 began life as an export fighter for Britain, powered by an Allison V1710 engine that offered respectable performance at low altitude, but struggled above 15,000 feet. It was competent, but unremarkable. A low-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that saw limited combat in North Africa and over-occupied Europe. Then the British did something extraordinary. In mid-1942, engineers at Rolls-Royce pulled the Allison engine from a Mustang airframe and installed a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same supercharged engine that powered the Spitfire. When test pilot Ronald Harker took the hybrid aloft over Hucknall, England, he realized immediately that something remarkable had just been born. The Merlin-powered Mustang did not just perform well at high altitude, it excelled. Suddenly, this American airframe had the speed, climb rate, and high-altitude capability to challenge any fighter in the world. Its maximum speed exceeded 440 miles per hour at altitude. Its service ceiling reached 42,000 feet. And crucially, devastatingly, it had range. With external drop tanks, the P-51 Mustang could fly escort missions of 1,375 miles. That meant a combat radius stretching from England to Berlin and back. For the first time in the war, American heavy bombers would have a fighter escort for the entire mission, from takeoff to target to landing. The Luftwaffe had never faced this before. The strategic impact was immediate and catastrophic for Germany. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the United States 8th Air Force had attempted daylight precision bombing of German industry. The theory was simple: mass formations of heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fight their way to the target using their combined defensive firepower. Formations of 10 to 20 bombers, each bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, would create a flying fortress that German fighters could not penetrate. The theory was wrong. Luftwaffe fighters adapted quickly. Twin-engine Bf-110s and Me-410s, armed with heavy cannons and rockets, stood off beyond machine gun range and lobbed projectiles into the formations. Single-engine Bf-109s and FW-190s attacked from head-on, exploiting the bomber's relatively weak nose armament. And German pilots waited patiently for the moment when American fighter escorts reached the limit of their range and turned back. Then they struck. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a massive raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt production facilities at Regensburg. Of the 376 bombers dispatched, 60 were lost. Another 100 returned with battle damage. 2 months later, on October 14th, Black Thursday, the Americans tried again. 229 B-17s fought through to Schweinfurt. 60 never returned. Only 20% made it back without damage. The losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids. The strategic bombing campaign, the backbone of Allied plans to cripple German war production, teetered on the edge of failure. The problem was range. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a superb fighter in its own right, could escort bombers roughly 475 miles with drop tanks. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning extended this slightly further. But neither could reach targets deep in southern Germany, and neither could stay with the bombers for the critical final leg when German fighters swarmed in for the attack. Then, in December 1943, the first P-51B Mustangs arrived in England. By February 1944, enough Mustangs had reached Europe to change everything. On February 20th, the Allies launched Operation Argument, soon to be known as Big Week. For 6 days, American bombers and their P-51 escorts hammered German aircraft production facilities across the Reich. RAF Bomber Command struck at night. The 8th Air Force struck by day. And for the first time, the P-51 Mustang flew deep escort all the way to the targets and back. But Major General Jimmy Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, added a twist. He changed the escort doctrine. Previously, American fighters had been ordered to stay close to the bombers at all times. If German fighters attacked, the escorts would drive them off, then immediately return to tight formation with the bombers. Doolittle freed the fighters. Now, P-51 pilots were given a single brutal directive: hunt down and eliminate the Luftwaffe wherever you find them. If that meant abandoning the bombers to chase a Messerschmitt back to its airfield and strafe it on the ground, so be it. If it meant free-ranging ahead of the bomber stream and ambushing German formations before they could form up for attack, do it. The Mustangs became hunter-killers. During Big Week, P-51 pilots claimed to have eliminated 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. German fighters that survived the bomber intercepts returned to base, only to find American fighters waiting, strafing aircraft on the ground, eliminating pilots as they tried to take off or land. The psychological impact on German pilots was devastating. Before the Mustang, Luftwaffe pilots could rely on sanctuaries. They could pull back beyond the range of Allied fighters, regroup, refuel, and prepare for the next attack. Now there was nowhere to hide. The Americans were over their airfields. They were over Berlin. They were everywhere. A Luftwaffe pilot captured during Big Week confessed during interrogation, "The appearance of the Mustang changed everything. We knew we were finished." It was not that the P-51 was invincible in a dogfight. In a turning battle at low altitude, a Spitfire might outturn it. A Yak-3 could match or exceed its maneuverability below 16,000 feet. The Mustang was not the most heavily armed fighter. Its 650 caliber machine guns were effective, but not overwhelming. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that the P-51 could go anywhere. It could escort bombers to targets the Luftwaffe thought were untouchable. It could loiter over German airspace, waiting for targets of opportunity. It could pursue fleeing German fighters all the way back to their bases and eliminate them during landing, when they were slowest, most vulnerable, and could not escape. This was the strategic nightmare. The Spitfire was deadly, but it guarded Britain. The Yak-3 was lethal, but it cleared Soviet airspace. The P-51 Mustang was the hunter that came to your home, eliminated your aircraft on the ground, and waited in the sky for you to take off so it could eliminate you again. By March 1944, P-51 Mustangs were escorting American bombers to Berlin itself. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, watched from the ground as American fighters circled over the German capital, untouchable and unafraid. His reported words have echoed through history. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." He was right. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was a broken force. Only 2 German aircraft appeared over the Normandy beaches. Allied bombers flew with impunity, hammering German positions, bridges, and supply lines. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies. The P-51 Mustang had achieved what no other fighter could. It had eliminated the Luftwaffe as a strategic threat. Not because it was the best dogfighter, not because it carried the most firepower, but because it had the range to project power anywhere over Europe, and the capability to dominate when it got there. The final tally speaks for itself. P-51 Mustangs claimed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft eliminated during World War II, more than any other American fighter, despite entering combat later than the P-38 or P-47. 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force flew Mustangs by late 1944. The Luftwaffe never recovered. German aircraft production actually increased in 1944, reaching its wartime peak despite relentless bombing. But it did not matter. Germany could build fighters faster than ever before, but it could not replace the pilots. The Mustang, freed to hunt, had eliminated the experienced cadre of Luftwaffe aces who could train replacements. By late 1944, German fighter squadrons were manned by undertrained teenagers with less than 50 hours of flight time, facing American pilots with hundreds of hours and dozens of victories. The war in the air was over. This is why the P-51 Mustang occupies a unique place in the Luftwaffe's hierarchy of fear. The British Spitfire was respected, feared even, in close combat over Britain. German pilots knew that engaging a Spitfire in a turning battle was often fatal. The Soviet Yak-3 was dreaded at low altitude on the Eastern Front. Luftwaffe directives warned pilots to avoid combat with it below 5,000 meters. But the P-51 Mustang was different. It was not feared for what it could do in a single engagement. It was feared for what it represented, the end of sanctuary. The Mustang meant that German pilots could be hunted anywhere, at any time, from England to Berlin. It meant that the strategic bombing campaign, the campaign that would cripple German war production and pave the way for invasion, was unstoppable. The Spitfire guarded the fortress. The Yak-3 dominated the battlefield. But the P-51 Mustang broke the Luftwaffe's back. When German fighter pilots looked up and saw the distinctive profile of a Mustang, sleek, fast, and impossibly far from home, they knew the war was lost. Not today, not this week, but inevitably, certainly lost. That is the difference. That is the fear. The Mustang did not just outfight the Luftwaffe. It eliminated their ability to fight at all. If you want more stories like this, where the machines of war shaped the course of history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got more deep dives coming on the aircraft, technology, and battles that decided World War II. Thanks for watching.